Our reading this morning is from Joshua chapter 24, verses 14 and 15. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your forefathers worshipped beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your forefathers served beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning, church family. So, welcome to those of you who are visiting with us this morning. We're really glad that you're here. If you don't know me, my name's Phil Brookman. I'm the preacher here, and this is a great church, and I hope you get to stick around and meet a lot of the people around you. That the people are the best part of this church, and so I certainly hope you can meet some of our folks and go to a Bible class after this service. So, when I was growing up, I learned about God in the Bible when I went to church. I learned about math and science when I went to school. But the primary place for my instruction about the world was my first job at Old Navy. And so I remember one day I was in the back room and the managers came out and said, "We're going to do some training on what to do when you see people shoplifting." I was like, all right. And so they get up and they said, if you see someone shoplift, you're not allowed to call them out. You can't accuse them of what they took. And I was like, well, why can't we do that? And she said, well, we've got to be really careful. We don't want to get sued. And so I said, well, what are we supposed to do if we see someone shoplift? And she said, all you can do is for example, if you see somebody put a pair of pants in their bag, you can just say, would you like a belt to go with those jeans? So I was like, all right. Well, I remember as a 16-year-old, I just thought this was the dumbest thing in the world. Like, number one, I want to be able to speak truth if someone's doing something wrong. And then number two, I was not convinced that there was actually that much stealing going on. Oh, was I wrong? There was so much stealing at Old Navy. It happened all the time. And a few months after this speech, I had seen so many people stuff things into their bags and walk out of the store that I just got really irritated one day. And this lady, she stuffed these 3 shirts into her purse, just not even trying to hide it. And so I walk up to her and I say, "Ma'am, would you like pants to go with those shirts?" And she looked at me and she says, "No, I wouldn't." And then she just arrogantly walks out of the store. And man, I just got really frustrated. And so I walked out after her. And I would never have done this today, but I was not very smart back then. I walked out. I watched her. She actually walked to the next store, which was Michael's. And so I changed out of my Old Navy shirt, put on a different T-shirt, and I walked straight into Michael's. And she was on some aisle, and I walked right up to her. She was looking like paper plates. And I got right in her face, and I said, "Would you like some paper cups to go with those paper plates?" Oh, I was not smart. What took next is the definition of a verbal beatdown. She took it to me, started using a lot of words that I cannot repeat, and she made me feel really small, and so I ended up running out of the store. So that's just what happens. Do you know do you know the code that we used to get to the back room in Old Navy back in those days? The code was 264, and that number represented how many items were stolen from Old Navy stores in the Metroplex per day. 264. You know that feeling when you hear a stat or you hear a story and it makes your heart sink because you are reminded again of how corrupt the world is? It happens a lot these days. So, for example, some of these things you already know, but just to remind you, 1 out of every 4 kids grows up without a dad in this country today. The numbers of people that live together and don't get married are way up. Number of people getting married, way down. The perception of how our culture and how our country thinks about sexuality is very, very different than it used to be. Pornography worldwide is a $97 billion industry. The gap between the rich and the poor is just as bad, if not worse, than it's ever been. When you take the last decade of mass shootings and compare it to the previous decade, the last decade of mass shootings in the U.S. went up by 280%. It's a really dark world. And what you and I tend to do is we hear these stats and we hear these stories and our hearts sink, and so we get together for lunch and we get together for coffee and we talk in the hallways and in our Bible classes, and the conversation is generally the same. Someone says, yeah, everything's just so messed up and this and that and the world's all corrupt, and the other person says, I know, what are we going to do about it? And we don't know. But it's bad, and we all know it's bad. And so here's what I want to offer you today. A little bit of good news is that it's been worse. It might seem really bad today, but it has been worse. We are going to look at what is the most violent, the most evil, the most corrupt, wicked book of the Bible, the book of Judges. Scott, I'm really glad you led all those songs about heaven, because that balances it out, because the book of Judges is pretty dark. And so if you've not been with us, let me just give you a snapshot of where we've been this year. We're talking about the Bible. We're going through the big story of the Bible, and so we began with creation, and then we talked about the fall and how the lies of the serpent have unraveled God's good creation. For several weeks now, we've been in the story of Israel. What does God want Israel to do to reverse the effects of the fall, to bring the blessing of God and the presence of God to the world? And he gave Israel a law to do this, to become the people by which the nations would come to know Yahweh. And Israel did not do well at this law. They were very, very corrupt, and they failed. And Judges is the epicenter of that failure. So I know on the one hand, Judges has a few good stories, like you got Ehud, and you got the stabbing of this King Eglon, and the flubber of the belly conceals the blade. I mean, that's pretty cool TV. And then you've got Gideon. That's a cool story. You've got 300 people, and they defeat this big army. You've got Samson. He's a really strong guy. So there's some good stories there. But overall, the book of Judges, it tells us what happens when people reject God. And so, just for a minute here, I want to give you an overview of what actually happens in the book of Judges, and then we'll talk about what do you do with it, and how might it relate to us today. So, to start, it is important to know the reason why everything went wrong in the book of Judges is, we learned about this in the beginning. Israel becomes very infatuated with the pagan cultures around them, and they become like those people. And so here's actually, let me just offer this. This is a practical point in the middle of the sermon, or really at the beginning of the sermon. You want to be careful who you like, because you will become like the people that you like. So if you like your friends, you're going to become like your friends. If you like a certain celebrity, you're going to become like that certain celebrity. You will be like the people that you like. And so you want to be careful who you like. And so this is the inception of what's going on at the beginning of Judges. Now here's what happens when they become like these pagan nations. Well, there's a lot of things I could say. I'm going to hit the lowlights here. So we're going to start with Gideon. Gideon's a great man, good story. Here's the last three things that happen in Gideon's life. Number one, he murders in cold blood these two men who won't give him bread. Number two, Gideon gets all the gold earrings from the people, and just like Aaron, he fashions an idol so the people can worship it. And then number three, Gideon sleeps with so many women that he has 70 kids. And then Gideon dies. Yay, Gideon. What a legacy. Now you've got 70 people that can take the throne after Gideon, so who's gonna ascend to be the next judge? Well, Abimelech is one of those 70, and here's what he does. He thinks, okay, well, how can I become the next judge? So he hires some assassins, and he calls all his siblings to a big meeting, and he murders all of his siblings so he can get to the throne. Well, this makes the people really mad, and so there's all these battles that ensue after Abimelech does this. And at one point, Abimelech takes an army, and he goes and he kills all these people in a field, and there's just a few left, and they hide in this building, men, women, and children. And so Abimelech gets his soldiers, and they all go to the woods, and they cut off branches, and they come to the building, and they stack these pieces of wood around the building, and they set fire to the building, and everybody in the building dies. That's Abimelech. Then you've got Jephthah later in the book, and he makes this vow to God that if God will give him victory in a battle, Jephthah will sacrifice whatever comes out of the house next, and Jephthah wins the battle, comes home. And do you remember the story? Who is it that comes out of the house? His daughter. So this isn't a good story. This is in the middle of the part of the Bible which shows us this is what happens when you don't follow God. And then you get Samson, who in our kids' books is this great hero. You would never want Samson to babysit your kids. Like, this guy was terrible. Like, early on, he basically orders, like, an online wife from a Philistine. And so then he goes there, and he's supposed to marry this woman. He doesn't have any friends, and so they supply him with 30 groomsmen for the wedding. Well, then he gets mad at the groomsmen, and they get in this big argument. So then he ends up killing these 30 people. The lady he was supposed to marry at the wedding, she marries somebody else. And so then Samson gets mad at that, so he goes and burns these people's fields. And so then they get mad that Samson burned their fields, and so then they kill the wife that was supposed to be Samson's wife. And then Samson gets mad at that, and he goes out and he kills 1,000 people. Like, this is horrible. And that's not even getting to the Delilah story yet. And then Delilah comes in, and you've got seduction and deception, and the eyes are plucked out, ending with this suicide mass killing. Like, yay, Samson. Like, that's the legacy of Samson. Well, at this point in the book of Judges, we would be about to chapter 17, and we read this really critical line. In fact, it's written down multiple times in the book of Judges. Judges chapter 17. Verse 6, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. This is just what life looks like when people don't follow Yahweh. And so here's the final 4 chapters of the book of Judges. You have this, the Benjamites get together, and there's this horrible, violent gang rape and murder of this innocent woman. Another part of Israel gets mad, and so they go to battle with the Benjamites. In this battle, a ton of people die, including a lot of the women from the tribe of Benjamin. And so the final scene of the book of Judges is the Benjamites are sitting around thinking, what do we do? Our women are gone. Well, we need some women. And so they go into a pagan country, and there's this mass kidnapping of all of these women, and they bring them back against their will to Israel. And the book of Judges ends. So this is a horrible, horrible picture of humanity. In fact, the very final sentence of the book of Judges, it's the same sentence that we read in 17. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. What do you do with this book of the Bible? Like, why is it there? How do you apply it? As believers in Jesus, as Christians, as people who want to live a good life, what do you do with the book of Judges? There's really 2 things you can do with it. One is you can zoom in, and you can talk about the cycle of rebellion. You've got sin, and then people repent, and then they're delivered, and that's it. The cycle's repeated all throughout the book. So you can zoom into that, and you can find that we're all part of that cycle. And you can even zoom in on some characters do some good things. Deborah, she does a few good things. Gideon, before he's corrupt at the end, he does a few good things. And it's not a bad thing to zoom in. In fact, if you're going to go to a Bible class today, you're going to do some zooming in to a few passages in the book of Judges. But I want to take a different route. Another thing you can do with the book of Judges is to zoom out and to look at where Judges sits when it comes to the big story of the Bible. And when you do that, something really interesting emerges. I want you to think about the bookends of the book of Judges. What comes right before Judges and what comes right after Judges in the book of the Bible, or in the books of the Bible. The book after Judges, at least in the way our Bible is arranged, is the book of Ruth. So in the book of Ruth, what you have is an individual who does what is right in the context of a world that is doing what is wrong. So you've got Ruth, and she follows the God of Naomi. That's the right thing to do. Or you've got Boaz. Boaz serves the poor. That's the right thing to do. Now let's go to the beginning of the book of Judges. What happens in the chapter before Judges 1? The chapter before Judges 1 is Joshua 24. In Joshua 24, Joshua gives the final instructions to his people before he passes away. It's the text that was just read to us, and it's an amazing speech. It reflects one man doing what's right in a world that's doing what's wrong. In fact, I want to reread part of that speech. Verse 15, Joshua says, "If serving the Lord seems undesirable to you," and I want to pause there and just say, there will always be people who will reject God. And we don't have to be surprised by that. So serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, and for some it will be undesirable. Then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. And so here I want to pause and say, Joshua acknowledges that what you believe and who you follow is a choice. And so I've preached on this before, but just to remind you, for people that choose to walk away from faith and they choose to turn their backs on God and the Bible and the church and Jesus, they're not just rejecting something, they're embracing something else. A step away from one thing is always a step towards something else. And Joshua makes this very clear. And so you know people in your life like this, and some of you in the room are probably thinking about this. You're wrestling with faith right now, but when you make the move towards atheism or agnosticism, that might seem like you're stepping into something very, very new. But the seeds for atheism and agnosticism took place in, at least the modern atheist and the modern agnostic, the original seeds for that came from a guy named Epicurus in 250 BC. From the things that he wrote, the things that he said, like he laid the foundation for the modern day agnostic and atheist movement. And so if that's you, just know you can walk away from faith. You can walk away from Christ, but don't be a fool as to think that what you're doing is new. You're actually embracing something just as old as the Bible itself. And so Joshua is saying, all right, you got to make a choice here. You can choose all these other gods, or, and then here's the final line he says, and this is such a good line. He says, "But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." And so here's the point I want to make about what do you do with the book of Judges as it relates to the larger biblical context. An immoral majority will always contain a righteous remnant. That's a really helpful and hopeful way to process and think about the story of Judges. And so really there's two questions which drive this part of the Bible, and these questions are, what is going to be the motivation that's going to fuel your life? Is it going to be, we will serve the Lord, or everyone did as they saw fit? These are the two worldviews at play in this part of the Bible. And we see these in our world too. I mean, your daily decisions are fueled deep down by one of two motives, to serve God or to serve self. And so these motives are very much at play in the book of Judges. And so here's what I want to do. I want to really ask a few questions here to help you and me think about a few areas of our life. And the big question is going to be, do you feel like, when it comes to the way you're living your life, are you more leaning into the righteous remnant, we're going to serve God. We're going to do the right thing in a world that's wrong. Or do you feel like you might be leaning into the immoral majority? You're just like everybody else that's kind of going away from truth and righteousness. So I want you to think about that. I'm going to give you 4 different areas of life to think about that question. The first one, it's your finances. $1 today does not go as far as $1 a year ago. Like it's an interesting financial storyline in our country. Budgets are tight, inflation's up, and so when you think about your finances, does the way you spend your money reflect the righteous remnant or the immoral majority? So like when your budget got tight, or if it is tight, or when it has got tight in the past, what's the first thing to change when it comes to you shifting how you're spending your money? Last week, we had a really interesting and fun birthday. I've never done a birthday party like this. So my grandpa died 5 years ago. He would have turned 100 last week. So we had a 100th birthday party for him. And we told lots of stories about my grandpa. One of the stories that I was reminded of was he went to a bank one time and he was cashing a check. And the check wasn't for a big amount, $30, $40. Gets the envelope, goes home. Later in the day, he goes to get that $40 out, and the bank has accidentally put $700 in that envelope. Now, what would you do if that happened to you? That's $700. Like, you might be able to make like one grocery store run with $700 with how much groceries cost today. But obviously, if you know my grandpa, he took it back and he gave the money back. Well, that's a way to handle his finances as a righteous remnant person. And so what about you? How would you categorize yourself there? And I'm not even just talking about spending habits. At a heart level, what's your relationship with your money like? Like, how tightly do you hold to it? Just think about that. Let me give you a second category here. So first would be your finances. The second would be your integrity. So when you think about your own character and your own integrity, do you put yourself more in the righteous remnant camp or the immoral majority camp? And the thing about character and integrity is most of us don't think about our own moral choices that often. And the reason we don't is because they've become normalized. Your integrity is very much tied to your habits. And then the very nature of what makes a habit is that when you do something over time for a long time, whatever that thing is, you no longer feel good or bad about it. It just is. It's the normalization of behavior. And so for a lot of us, we just don't think about our integrity one way or the other. However, think about this. Just because something is normal doesn't make it moral. And so you might be engaged in some kind of a behavior with what you do, with what you say, with what you think, and it's very normal to you. You don't think twice about it. But just because it's normal, that doesn't mean that it's ethical. It doesn't mean that it's moral in the eyes of God. And so here's three ways to think about your integrity. What goes into the heart, what stays in the heart, what comes out of the heart. What goes in, what stays there, what comes out. So just think for a minute, what are the kinds of things you're putting in your heart? Like what sitcoms do you watch? And what do you scroll on your news feed? And what music do you listen to? And what kinds of content are you consistently taking in to your heart? Because that does shape and affect what is in your heart. Like, you know, if you eat a donut, it's going to taste really, really good, but you're going to pay for it later. Well, the same metaphor can be applied to our content. The things that we take in shape us over time, and some have more quality than others. So what do you take into your heart? Number 2, what stays in your heart? Like when you're just sitting around your house and your room, when you're driving and the radio's not on, like what do you think about when you have nothing going on? Like, do you find yourself going towards you're mad about something, you're bitter about something? Do you find yourself going to impure thoughts? Like what stays in your heart? That's a reflection of your integrity. And then third, what comes out? What are the kinds of things that you say? to people that you love, or just people that you go to school with, or people that you work with? How do you treat people? What comes out? So what goes in, what stays in, what comes out? 3 ways to think about your integrity. And again, overall, I'm simply asking you to reflect. Would you place yourself more in the Joshua Ruth camp? Yeah, we're the remnant. Or would you say, no, I'm more in the book of Judges? A few months ago, one of the young adults in our church came into my office. We were talking about life, and this was in the middle of a series I preached on idolatry. And he said, Phil, I was at a movie the other day, and I got 30, 40 minutes in, and it just dawned on me that what I was taking in was not good for my soul. So I got up, and I walked out. I was really encouraged to hear that story. I feel like in generations past, that was a very normal thing. That doesn't happen a lot today. People walking out on something because they don't feel like it's good for their soul, but that's a sign of his integrity. So again, you think about this in your life. Where would you place yourself in the category of integrity between righteous remnant and immoral majority? The third category is this: your relationships. Like, I want you to think about the people that you're really close to. Like, if you're a single person, I want you to think about the friend group that you spend the most time with. If you're married, you think about your spouse, you think about your kids. If you're a kid, think about living at home. I want you to think about your siblings, think about your parents. How are you treating those people? Like, are you treating them according to like how Ruth treats Naomi, like this righteous remnant? Or are you a jerk to these people? Or even go to this category in your mind. Think about the relationship that you have with someone that's really messy. It's just totally out of whack, and you said something and she said something, and now you guys aren't friends anymore, and you don't really know how to respond to this because there's this big elephant in your relationship, and you don't know what to do. It's just messy. Like, how are you handling that? Like, how are you stewarding this really, really messy relationship? Like, do you find yourself full of bitterness and hate and anger? Or are you trying to forgive? Like, how are you doing this here? One of our members was telling me this story the other day. It was an inspiring story to me. So we'll call him James, a guy named James. When he's 14 years old, he goes to dinner one night. There's 4 place settings for dinner. His sister and his mom are there. They sit down for dinner. The mom gets a text. She starts crying. Kids ask, Mom, what's wrong? And she says, your dad's not coming home. So at 14 years old, James's dad leaves his mom for another woman and is pretty much out of his life. Comes back here and there, but it's always sporadic. It's always manipulative. It's just bad. And so he endures all of his teenage years without the constant presence of a father, and he does the best that he can. So a few years ago, he's 25, 26 years old, and he gets married. And he thinks through the question, do I invite my dad to the wedding? Talks to several people. He doesn't exactly know what to do. His mom says, this is between you and the Lord. You can do whatever you want to do, and I'll support it. James decides he's going to invite his dad. So he calls his dad up. He says, hey, I know it's been a weird decade, but I'd love you to be at the wedding if you want to come. Dad didn't come to the wedding. So it's kind of a sad ending, but the thing I really appreciated about that story is that James conducted himself with integrity. He didn't have any regrets as far as how he handled himself. I mean, that is a very righteous remnant move, to lean into forgiveness to a man that has hurt you deeply. So again, what about you? I want you to think about that person, that man, that woman that you don't see eye to eye with now. How are you handling that relationship? Final category I want to throw your way is, how do you handle your suffering? Everybody suffers. Not everybody suffers faith fully. Suffering is one of those things that connects us all as human beings. Grief is grief, and we all feel it when it happens to us. And it's hard, and there's an emotional weight to it. When you're disappointed, when you have a dream that you thought was going to happen and that dream is shattered. When you're in a relationship and the relationship dissolves, when something doesn't go your way, when someone that you love passes away, it hurts. So we all suffer. It's universal. But there are some people that they suffer differently. Like there's a really righteous way to suffer with God, to suffer with faith rather than without faith. And so think about how you handle your suffering. I ran into an old friend a few weeks ago, and my memory was drawn back to this is 15, 20 years ago. His dad died in a car wreck. Super sudden, tragic. One of those things that it doesn't make any sense. There's no silver lining. There's no, but it was just bad. It was just bad. But I remembered, this is a long time ago when this happened, he found out in the middle of the night. And he pulled a few of his friends together in the middle of the night, and he says, I want you to pray for me. And so I actually remember standing outside in a circle of guys with this friend who was grieving, and we put our hands on him, and we just, I don't know what we said, but we started praying. We said something to God. And early on, this memory, at least for me, I see it as his attempt at the very beginning of this tragedy to suffer with the Lord. And so I ran into this friend just a few weeks ago. I hadn't seen him in a long time. And what he's doing with his life now is he's in ministry. And he's giving his life to the church. And he's using his story of pain and suffering to serve something that is greater. And so again, I ask you, when it comes to your suffering, are you functioning more in the role of righteous remnant? I'm going to suffer with faith. Or are you suffering just the way that the rest of the immoral world suffers, without hope? Let's just cope and move on. So again, all this, I'm just trying to get you to reflect on which group would you place yourself in. Now, final thing I want to say is simply this. Being the remnant's really hard. Like, it is very hard to live in an immoral world and be a person of faith. Like, it's very, very difficult. But one thing I want to point out, that I read this in Ruth, I sense this in Joshua, and it's this. They did not spend all of their time lamenting what was bad. They spent more of their time living what was good. And we are faced with that choice all the time. Like, what are you going to do with the fact that the world's corrupt? What are you going to do about that? Well, I will confess that there are moments in my life where what I choose to do is just complain to whoever's around me about how bad it is. I lament the bad. But what happens to someone if they spend all of their life coping with the pain of the world by complaining about the pain of the world, rather than living this alternative lifestyle of goodness and righteousness? Well, that person is just going to become a very grumpy person. Like, there's a different way to do this. And again, this is what you see in the book of Ruth. This is what you see in Joshua 24, that the world's totally messed up, but that they're living into the goodness of what they hope can be, rather than just berating what is wrong with the world. Like what would it look like for you to concentrate your efforts on embodying the good that you want, rather than berating the bad that you hate? Like, again, this is a choice, and we all have to make it every single day. Like, until Jesus comes back, the world's going to be messed up. It just is. Like, there's always going to be a news story that's going to make your heart drop. There's always going to be a statistic that you're going to just shake your head and think, what's going on with the world? It just is. And so it's not a good stewardship of your own time and your energy to be angry at a world that has rejected God. This is just the world. That's the way it's going to be until Jesus comes back. There's always going to be racism. There's always going to be sexual immorality. There's always going to be manipulation and deception and greed. Like, it's going to be here. It's not good, but we don't have to be surprised by it. On the flip side, as the author of Hebrews tells us, God is the author and perfecter of our faith, or Jesus is the author and perfecter. So he's at the beginning and the end. So as long as God's on the throne, this also means that there's always going to be truth in the world. And there's always going to be fidelity in the world. And there's always going to be integrity in the world. And the reason that's true is because there's always going to be a remnant. And you're part of that remnant. And so you have a choice of what you're going to do when you hear news about the world falling apart. You can either fret that it's all going wrong, or you can spend your effort embodying the lifestyle that chooses what is good and that chooses what is true. So here's one of the most hopeful things about this horrible book of Judges. It's that God doesn't give up on his people. Isn't that a cool thought? Like in this book full of hate and murder and rape and civil war and kidnapping and deception and ambiguity. Like, this is a horrible book of the Bible. God doesn't give up on those people. And that means God does not give up on you. So I do not know what you are going through. Some of you are probably in the middle of a pretty big sin right now and you don't know what to do. Others of you are in the middle of a huge season of suffering and you don't really know what to do either. Please be assured that God's right there. He's not ashamed of you. He's with you. And he will not give up on you. If you need something from this church family, I'd encourage you to come tell me about that while we stand and sing.